When you hear the name Goldman Sachs, you probably imagine powerful family dynasties controlling a multi-trillion-dollar Wall Street empire from mahogany boardrooms. But here's the twist that would make Marcus Goldman roll over in his grave. Not a single person named Goldman or Sachs owns a meaningful piece of it. Yes, while you're building wealth through index funds, you're actually owning more of Goldman Sachs than the families who built it. Therefore, in today's episode of Old Money Luxury, we explore how building an empire can become the most effective way to exile yourself from it forever. $2 trillion. That's the empire the Goldman Sachs family supposedly lost, according to breathless internet rumors and financial conspiracy theorists who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a bedsheet. The suspense ends here. They never had $2 trillion to lose. This delicious myth has spread like champagne gossip at a Hamptons party, each retelling adding another zero, another scandal, another dramatic flourish to a story that's already extraordinary without the embellishment. The confusion stems from a rather mundane inability to distinguish between managing money and owning money, rather like confusing the butler with the lord of the manor. Goldman Sachs, the investment bank, does indeed handle trillions in client assets today, moving money around the globe with the casual efficiency of a Vegas dealer shuffling cards. But handling and owning remain distinctly different concepts. At their absolute zenith in 1914, the actual Goldman and Sachs families controlled a firm with capital of approximately $1,600,000, about $50 million in today's money. Substantial for a Bavarian immigrant's grandson, certainly, but we're talking millions with an M, not trillions with a T. The real story is far more intriguing than any trillion-dollar fairy tale, how two Jewish immigrant families built one of Wall Street's most formidable institutions, only to lose control of it completely, leaving nothing but their names on the letterhead, like abandoned luggage tags. Today, when tourists gawk at Goldman Sachs's gleaming tower at 200 West Street, they're looking at a $107 billion corporation where not a single Goldman or Sachs descendant owns a meaningful stake. The founding families have been about as welcome there as a bacon sandwich at a bar mitzvah. The story unfolds through death by 1,000 cuts, family feuds, near bankruptcy, gradual dilution, and finally, the ultimate indignity of watching their partnership transformed into a public corporation owned by faceless index funds. The internet's $2 trillion fantasy makes for clickbait heaven, but the truth carries its own bitter irony. The Goldman Sachs families lost control of an institution that would grow to heights they never imagined, wealth they would never touch. The last Goldman family member with any real say in the firm was forced out in 1917 over a disagreement about Kaiser Wilhelm of all things, which tells you everything about how a basement office on Pine Street became the most exclusive club from which its own founders would be permanently blackballed. Marcus Goldman arrived in America in 1848, carrying the two things that would define his legacy: an unpronounceable Bavarian surname and an understanding that in business, trust mattered more than capital. Born in 1821 in Bavaria to an Ashkenazi Jewish family, Goldman fled the periodic violence and permanent restrictions that made Jewish life in the German states a negotiation with persecution. He started as a clothing merchant, wandering the American Northeast with a horse and wagon, learning English from customers who mocked his accent while buying his wares. By 1869, Goldman had saved enough to rent a basement office next to a coal chute on Pine Street in Manhattan, where he began trading commercial paper, essentially IOUs that businesses used for short-term financing. The business model was elegantly simple. Goldman would stuff these promissory notes in the tall hat he wore, walk from business to business, and match those who needed money with those who had it, taking a cut of typically 5%. Within his first year, he handled $5 million worth of these transactions, earning $250,000, roughly $7,500,000 in today's currency. The transformation from family business to family empire began in 1882 when Goldman invited his daughter Louisa's husband, Samuel Sachs, to join the firm. The company became M. Goldman & Sachs, and a pattern emerged that would define the next half-century. Every expansion came through blood or marriage. In 1885, Marcus's son Henry Goldman joined, along with another son-in-law, Ludwig Dreyfus, officially creating Goldman Sachs and Company. Another daughter married Samuel Sachs's brother, creating a web of relationships so intertwined that family dinners doubled as board meetings. For 50 years, from 1869 to 1912, this remained absolute policy. Only those named Goldman or Sachs or married into the families could own a piece of the firm. The arrangement reflected both old-world Jewish traditions of keeping businesses within trusted family networks and New World realities where ethnic outsiders needed their own protective institutions. While the Protestant establishment had their clubs and connections, the Goldman Sachs families built their own fortress of capital and kinship. By 1900, they had perfected a system where sons learned the business from fathers, daughters cemented alliances through marriage, and profits stayed within an ever-expanding but carefully controlled family circle. The firm's capital grew from Marcus Goldman's initial stake to $1,600,000 by 1914, every penny owned by people who shared either genes or grandchildren with the founder. Yet this very insularity that protected them would also doom them, for in 1912 they made a decision that would begin unraveling 5 decades of family control. They invited their first outsider to become a partner. Henry Goldman possessed the kind of vision that transformed a commercial paper business into an investment banking empire, taking companies public that other banks wouldn't touch because their owners prayed in synagogues rather than churches. His masterpiece came in 1906 when he convinced Sears, Roebuck and Company to let Goldman Sachs handle their initial public offering, pioneering the use of retail sales rather than hard assets to value the company. By 1914, Henry had gained such stature that government officials consulted him on the design of the Federal Reserve System, recognizing that this grandson of a Bavarian peddler understood American finance better than most blue-blooded bankers. The first crack in family control appeared in 1912 when they admitted Henry S. Bowers as a partner. Not a Goldman, not a Sachs, not even Jewish, but necessary for the firm's expansion beyond its ethnic niche. Then came 1917, and a disagreement that would shatter the founding families forever. Henry Goldman supported Germany during World War I, refusing to participate in war bond drives, viewing the conflict through the lens of his Bavarian heritage rather than his American citizenship. The Sachs family, led by Samuel and his brothers, demanded patriotic conformity. The confrontation was volcanic. Henry was forced to resign, taking his capital, his clients, and his branch of the family name with him. This left the Sachs family in complete control. The Goldman influence reduced to nothing more than 5 letters on the masthead. In 1918, they brought in Waddell Catchings, a smooth-talking Southerner with grand ambitions and fatal flaws. By 1928, Catchings had convinced the conservative Sachs brothers to launch the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation, a closed-end investment trust designed to let ordinary investors participate in the stock market boom. The structure was leverage upon leverage. GSTC created Shenandoah Corporation in July 1929, which spawned Blue Ridge Corporation just 25 days later, each entity borrowing to invest in the next. A financial house of cards reaching toward the sky. When October 1929 arrived, the collapse was spectacular. GSTC shares plummeted from $326 to $1.75, a 98% loss that remains one of the most catastrophic in Wall Street history. By January 1930, market capitalization had fallen from over $400 million to $233 million, and by mid-1932, barely $40 million, equivalent to losing $4 billion in today's currency. Goldman Sachs accounted for 70% of all losses among major investment trusts, a distinction that nearly destroyed the firm. Capital shrank to levels not seen since the 1890s. 3 decades of progress evaporated in 3 years of hubris. Facing annihilation, the Sachs family made a decision that would save the firm, but end their control. They turned to Sidney Weinberg, who had started as a janitor's assistant for $3 a week. Sidney Weinberg ruled Goldman Sachs for 39 years until his death in 1969, and during that reign, He transformed a family firm into something the founding families would barely recognize. Each year brought new partners with names like Whitehead and Friedman and Rubin, men who owed nothing to the Sachses except a paycheck, men who viewed the firm's history as quaint mythology rather than sacred birthright. The partnership expanded relentlessly through the 1970s and 80s, diluting what little family ownership remained until the Sachs descendants held stakes so small they might as well have been rounding errors. By the 1990s, the question consuming Goldman Sachs wasn't about family legacy, but about survival in a new financial landscape where competitors like Morgan Stanley had already gone public and gained access to permanent capital. The partnership held 84 contentious meetings between 1995 and 1998, debating whether to abandon the structure that had defined the firm since Marcus Goldman's day. John Corzine, who became senior partner in 1994, pushed hardest for the initial public offering, arguing that Goldman Sachs needed public capital to compete globally. The old guard resisted, clinging to traditions that no longer included them, a bitter irony lost on none of the participants. When the vote finally came in 1998, it wasn't close. The partners voted overwhelmingly to sell the firm they no longer owned to strangers they would never meet. On May 4, 1999, Goldman Sachs Group Incorporated began trading on the New York Stock Exchange at $53 per share. The offering raised $3,657 million by selling 69 million shares, roughly 15% of the company. The prospectus revealed the truth that insiders already knew. 221 executives controlled 60% of the shares, and not a single person named Goldman or Sachs appeared among them. The founding families had been so thoroughly expelled that they couldn't even claim token representation. What remained of the Sachs family influence watched from the sidelines as their ancestors' creation joined the same public markets it had once helped other companies enter. The firm was valued at $33 billion that day, $990 billion in today's currency, wealth that would have staggered Marcus Goldman's imagination but would never touch his descendants' bank accounts. The transformation was complete. From a basement office where a Bavarian immigrant stuffed IOUs in his hat to a publicly traded corporation where algorithms made more decisions than humans. The partnership structure that had preserved family control for 130 years dissolved in a single day of trading. Those who bought shares that morning were purchasing pieces of an institution whose founders' descendants couldn't afford to be major shareholders in. A cosmic joke written in stock symbols and decimal points. The masters of Goldman Sachs today are three asset management giants whose names sound like law firms designed by committee: Vanguard Group, BlackRock, and State Street Global Advisors. Vanguard owns 8.9%, making it the largest shareholder, a company founded in 1975 by John Bogle, who would have been rejected from Marcus Goldman's synagogue for being too goyish. BlackRock controls 7.2%, managed by algorithms and overseen by executives who probably think Yom Kippur is a tech startup. State Street Global Advisors holds 5.9%, completing a trinity of institutional ownership that represents everything the founding families stood against: faceless, bloodless, profitable. Together, institutional investors own 71% of Goldman Sachs, meaning the firm is controlled by pension funds in Peoria, index funds tracking the S&P 500, and retirement accounts belonging to dentists who've never set foot on Wall Street. The current chief executive officer is David Solomon, who moonlights as the electronic dance music DJ under the name D-Sol, a detail that would have sent Samuel Sachs into apoplectic shock. Solomon earned $62,500,000 in 2023, more than the founding families ever saw in their lifetimes combined. The board of directors reads like a diversity consultant's dream. Former government officials, tech executives, academics, not a single Goldman or Sachs among them. Search the company's annual reports, proxy statements, or corporate governance documents for any mention of the founding families, and you'll find nothing. They've been erased more thoroughly than Trotsky from a Stalin-era photograph. The investment bank that bears their names generated revenue of $46,300,000,000 in 2023, employed 45,000 people, and maintained offices in every major financial center on Earth. Its market capitalization stands at $107 billion as of 2025, wealth that exists in electronic ledgers and quarterly earnings calls rather than family vaults. The Sachs descendants, scattered across America, work as doctors and teachers and lawyers, respectable professions that pay well, but not Goldman Sachs well. Some still live in New York, walking past 200 West Street on their way to work, anonymous pedestrians outside the tower their great-great-grandfather built. The final irony cuts deepest. Marcus Goldman fled Bavaria to escape a system that excluded Jews from mainstream finance, built an institution to rival the Protestant establishment, only to have his descendants excluded from the very firm that bears his name. Today's Goldman Sachs belongs to everyone and no one, a public corporation as emotionally connected to its founders as McDonald's is to the McDonald brothers. The family empire that never was $2 trillion has become a $100 billion corporation where the only thing that remains of the Goldmans and Sachses is 14 letters arranged on a logo, a ghost story told in sans serif font. The transformation of Goldman Sachs from a family partnership to a faceless corporation represents the fundamental shift in modern capitalism, from personal relationships to institutional power. Marcus Goldman built his business on trust, carrying IOUs in his hat while walking from business to business, whereas today's Goldman Sachs operates through algorithms and quarterly earnings reports. Perhaps the greatest irony is that a firm founded specifically to create a space for Jewish financiers excluded from Protestant banking circles has now excluded its own founding families. With that said, we'd love to see you in the comments. Were you aware of the story behind the actual families involved in Goldman Sachs, or is this your first time hearing about them? We look forward to hearing your thoughts below, and thank you for watching another episode of Old Money Luxury. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.